So Lee and Lee and the creator of the DAN A4SFX, they got together and created this. This is the new DAN A4-H2O. We had a look at the prototype a few months ago, some of you might remember, but this right here is the finished model. And at about 11 liters in total volume, you would be really surprised by how uncompromising this PC case actually is. And to be honest, I think this is about as small as you can make a PC case today while still retaining the full hardware compatibility and thermal performance of modern high-end components. We're talking huge 3-slot graphics cards and support for 240mm liquid coolers, all in a PC case this small. And I think the timing here is absolutely perfect. There is no other case right now that can fit these components in this size. The Ncase M1 is a little bit bigger and the Form T1 is a little bit smaller, but both are just unavailable. The new A4-H2O fits right in between those two legendary ITX cases, both in terms of size and hardware compatibility, but it's quite a bit cheaper and will actually be available to buy. Visually as well, it can definitely sit beside those two highly regarded PC cases. The clean, boxy, simple exterior feels like the tribute to small form factor that this case aims to be. There's no modern trends like tempered glass or mesh, just a nice, compact, optimized PC case. I will say though that the new A4-H2O is a little rougher around the edges compared to what I'm used to seeing from Lee & Lee and DAN case. It's still a premium aluminium construction, don't get me wrong, but the tolerances and fitment could be a little bit better. Then on the inside, honestly, nothing too crazy. It's your typical sandwich layout with your motherboard and power supply on one side and your GPU on the other, and then a 240mm liquid cooler up top. We've seen this layout done over and over again, and honestly, it's nothing too worth, going in depth on. However, I will say the A4-H2O gets pretty much perfect scoring in my books, in regard to how much volume is divided up for each compartment. When you are really pushing the limits of this case, you can appreciate how well everything just fits together. It just seems to give you the perfect amount of tolerance and breathing room for each side without giving too much extra. So then, how hard is it to actually build in? So to get things started here, we have these 4 thumb screws at the back of the case. Now, I will admit they do not look the best. They are also kind of pointless, as you're about to see. Pretty easy to remove though, you've just got 2 for each side panel. But then take a look at this, we're using the same kind of push pin mounting mechanism as a lot of other Lee & Lee cases, but man, these are just so stiff for whatever reason. I have no idea why, but if you just want to run the case without those thumb screws on the back, in my opinion, it does look a lot cleaner. That is totally doable because, as you can see, the side panels are very, very locked in. Then on the interior of the case, you'll find all of your cables, of course, and then zip tied to that, you will find your screws for your motherboard, your power supply, your SSDs, and also 2 zip ties, which is a bit of an odd choice to include only 2 zip ties, but hey, maybe those will come in handy. So this is actually my first time working with the case, so I do apologize if it is not as fluid as some of my other builds, but the first thing that is recommended to install here, and man, these push pins are really just unnecessarily strong. The first thing that we're going to install here is our 240mm liquid cooler. Now, DAN A4-H2O, as the name suggests, this is a liquid cooling focused case. This is not a case that you want to be air cooling, in my opinion, because you only have about 55 mils of clearance for the pump block or the CPU cooler. So let's go ahead and mount the liquid cooler. The first thing that is recommended to do here is remove the power supply bracket. Thankfully, these screws are not too hard to remove. You've got 2 at the top there and another 2 at the bottom. And this should just be able to be removed. Yep, that's nice and easy. Put that to the side. And then, as you can probably tell, this compartment up here is where our liquid cooler is going to be installed. So it's going to be a top mounted configuration, and we're going to have the air pulling up through the case. So we're going to have air coming through the side panels and then exhausting up the top. We have 240 mils of clearance, I guess you could say. A 240mm AIO will fit up there. And then in terms of like the thickness clearance, we have 55 mils of thickness to play with. So that means a 30mm thick rad and 25mm or standard thickness fans. So I'm guessing the next step is to remove this radiator bracket here, which sits on the top of the case. So we're going to mount our liquid cooler to this and then drop it into the top of the case. The specific liquid cooler that I've gone with here is the EK AIO Basic 240mm. No real specific reason other than I know it looks super clean. I know it fits in this case, no problem. The NZXT Kraken series will fit as well. And yeah, also just kind of wanted to try something a little bit different. I know the EK AIOs are pretty popular option in small form factor ITX cases and just cases in general. The main point being is that we are under that pump block height limit. We do have flexible tubing as well, so that's going to be nice and easy to route within the case. And the physical size of the radiator itself too, that's not going to be a problem in this case. Also kind of cool to see that EK do include a fan splitter for their AIOs. That's not something that's included with all of the liquid coolers out there. The next thing that we're going to do is mount our fans, of course. The radiator bracket, which we have off to the side here, is going to go on the other side. So we will have to completely mount the fans, and then we'll take a look at what that looks like. All right, pretty straightforward. Fans are mounted. Next up is to mount the radiator bracket. And I'm just gonna go ahead and install the AIO pretty much dead center on the radiator bracket. I'm guessing that's gonna be fine. Sometimes with cases, you'll need to kind of install it a little bit offset on one side, but it looks like this should be fine. We'll see in a moment. And this should be as easy as just dropping this in now. That should just drop nicely in. So yeah, really satisfying fitment there. You just drop the radiator in and it just sits there quite nicely. And then yeah, to finish that off, we basically just have the 4 radiator bracket screws. So just pushing these cables off to the side here, we'll be dealing with those in a moment. One thing that I do actually like about this case is how clean this radiator installation and fan installation is, because usually this top section is exposed, but Dan and Lee have gone for the option of just having this kind of really clean guard here. Not sure if that has any impact or improvement when it comes to thermals, but at least when it comes to the visuals of the case, it does make it look a whole lot cleaner. But just putting the pump block off to the side there, because the next thing that we need to do is install our motherboard. Now, not really worth going over too much, what I'm using here, because everyone is going to be different, and to be honest, it doesn't matter too much. But I will note the stuff that does matter. So first off, the RAM DIMMs, you don't want to go with anything too tall. I think I've gone with pretty much the tallest DIMMs that you can install possibly in this case. And the reason for that is because you do need to actually route the AIO tubes over the RAM DIMMs. So we will see how these fare up. I might actually swap these out for something that's a little bit more low profile, but again, we'll see how these go. And the next kind of really important thing is what kind of CPU you go with, because obviously in ITX case, we are limited with the amount of airflow that we have. And we're also limited with the CPU cooler. Now, 240mm liquid cooler, relatively powerful, but with CPUs like the 12900K kind of being possible to install here, that is not something that I would recommend. So here we have the 12700K. I do believe that's going to be the limit here, but again, we will see how that turns out. So just moving those cables out of the way, also note the PCIe riser cable down the bottom there. Definitely don't want to squish that, so just make sure that there's room for that too. And then just dropping the motherboard in is actually pretty easy, a little bit easier than I was expecting. And I've just flipped the case here so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better, but basically we're just securing the motherboard to the case, and the motherboard screws will be the smallest screws that you'll find in the little packet. The bottom left-hand screw is actually almost impossible to tighten due to the huge M.2 heatsink and due to the panel guards. You can't actually get the screwdriver in. It's not actually too much of a problem because the motherboard is quite secure in there. But yeah, just note that only 3 out of the 4 screws are actually possible to install. Next order of business will be that PCIe riser cable, which is, conveniently already pre-bent and sitting there. So just line that up and then push it in. You should hear a nice satisfying click. Next order of business is mounting our pump block to our CPU. And in terms of tube routing, I've had a quick look at it. Mounting it like this and having the tubes route on this side of the motherboard, and also having the tubing go kind of above the motherboard, that kind of looks like the most sensible way to do things. But unfortunately, I'm not sure if you guys can see this, the pump leads are actually hitting the VRM heatsink. And this is one of the issues that I brought up in my recent kind of 12900K ITX problem video, is that the clear out zone is just kind of shrinking and shrinking and shrinking on these Z690i motherboards, which is really a shame. And I'm just gonna try again, see if I can get this secured. But it just doesn't look like that's gonna happen, unfortunately. That would have been a really clean tube routing option. It might be an option for other motherboards out there, but at least on the Z690i Aorus Ultra and definitely on the Z690i Unify from MSI, that tube routing with the leads on the left side of the board is just not gonna happen. So let's now try with the tubes on the right side of the board. And it does look like that is possible, but we are pushing on the RAM DIMMs here, which I definitely do not like. The tube routing is also not as clean, kind of kinks around the motherboard DIMMs. And yeah, I'm definitely not liking how I'm pushing on these RAM DIMMs here. I don't know if the camera is picking that up. Hopefully we don't have any like boot or compatibility issues there. But yeah, this is literally the only way to mount this AIO with this motherboard. Alright, so skipping ahead a little bit, I've installed all of the motherboard cables. Pretty straightforward and honestly pretty boring to show on video. But there we have the USB-C cable, the USB 3.0 cable. I've connected all of the fans. I've used the fan splitter that's kindly provided by EK. And I've plugged in our top radiator fans, as well as kind of, pre-routed this tubing here for our next step, which is installing the power supply. So of course for this step, we'll need our power supply bracket, which is the first bracket that we removed in the beginning. We will of course need our power supply screws, which we'll find in the small packet, and the power supply itself. Now, a word of warning here, this case does support SFX L units, which basically means same sort of footprint that we have here. This is an SFX unit, but it is quite a bit longer, and I really don't think that is the way to go here in SFX cases. I mean, when you have an option like this is the SF750 from Corsair, 750 watts, 80 plus platinum rated. With any single GPU configuration that you're going to install in this case, you are just not reaching the output of what this thing can handle. I mean, even if you have 12900K RTX 3090 running, full load at the same time, you're probably getting close to what this thing can handle, but I mean, that is really a very rare use case. So I think, all things considered, trying to be as compact as possible while being quiet and also, having a sensible power rating, SF750 is kind of what I'm recommending here. And then in terms of installation, pretty straightforward. The fan is going to kind of face this perforated side here, and then we're just going to go ahead and screw those 4 screws in at the top. Next thing that you want to do is make sure that the power supply is, of course, turned on, because that's going to be almost impossible to reach once the build is actually fully put together. And then also plug in that power supply cable. And one thing that I'm definitely noticing here is how difficult it is, to properly route these AIO tubes. Since the only way that we could route ours was on the right side of the motherboard and not kind of up and over, we do have quite a lot of excess tubing here, which is, let's take a look. It's probably going to be a bit difficult to work with. And at this point, we should also be dealing with our power supply cables. Those are going to go that way. GPU cables are going to go through. And it looks like that power supply is now seated in the correct position. But the only thing now is I don't know if graphics card installation is going to be a pain with that kind of tube excess on the other side. We'll take a look in just a second. So just securing this bracket is a little bit more difficult than it needs to be because we are working with a bit of extra force. Next thing that we're going to do is plug in our power supply cables, which is actually pretty straightforward. Motherboard 24 pin goes there. And the CPU 8 pin can actually route down the bottom here and then up to the left. And then you could potentially use some zip ties to, tidy this up, make it look a little bit neater. But I think all things considered, this actually looks quite clean. More importantly though, let's take a look at what's going on the flip side, because like I said, we do have that excess tubing. Hopefully that doesn't get in the way. As we can see, it kind of is. So that is quite a problem. Definitely want to make sure that we clear that up. So yeah, not super happy with how those cables are routed up the top here. I do think that they are going to be hitting those fans. And just to show you how, tightly packed everything is here, it is a pain just to get this power supply out. All right, so that seems to be sitting a little bit more comfortable in there. Definitely don't want to have those tubes or those fan cables, touching those radiator fans. That's going to be a bit of a pain. And the next order of business is installing our graphics card. Now, I actually think this is going to be pretty difficult because the graphics card that we're going with here is pretty much the biggest that you can install in this case, which is the ROG Strix. So in terms of what we're working with here, you can install up to a 3-slot graphics card up to 322 millimeters in length, I believe, which is pretty much exactly what the ROG Strix is. So to make life a little bit easier, it's advised to go ahead and remove this bottom bracket. That way you can kind of reach in from all angles here. And we're also going to be removing the front panel as well. So first things first, you're going to release this little tab here for the PCIe riser cable slot. And honestly, the first thing that I'm probably going to do here is plug in the power cables for the GPU, because I think this is going to be pretty hard to access once we actually get the card installed. So that's it. Power cables are installed, and yeah, this is a huge graphics card, but I guess the test here is just to see if this thing will actually fit. Honestly, I have my doubts looking at it. It is just super, super massive. But the next thing that we're going to do here is remove the PCI expansion slots. And now we have probably the craziest part of this entire build, which is actually fitting this graphics card in here, which, yeah, I do have my doubts, honestly, looking at it. How am I actually going to even get this in here? Do we feed it through the front? I think that might be the best option. All right, maybe plugging in the power cables was a bad idea. Let's leave the power cables for the end. So the DEN A4-H2O has this big kind of cutout at the front, which is, I guess, there so that you can feed the graphics card through. But let's see how usable this actually is. All right, I can't believe this is actually looking like it's working. Now, obviously, if you're working with a much smaller graphics card, you're not going to have this kind of problem. But this is actually looking like it might work. Again, the dimensions say that this card will fit, but it is really up against the upper limits of what we can install here. And it is actually looking like it's gonna fit. And we do actually have fitment. Wow, that is actually kind of mind-blowing that that fits. So yeah, the card is pretty much fully seated at this point. I've locked the PCIe riser cable tab at the bottom. Now we just have to screw it in at the back here and then plug in our cables. And now plugging in these PCIe power cables for the GPU should be no problem at all, since we can, remove that bottom panel and have full access to the bottom. So there we go, power cables are installed. Actually not too difficult since we have that big opening at the bottom here and that we can actually remove that panel. That will be going on next. But yeah, actually not too difficult considering what we just did. I mean, the ROG Strix is a freaking huge graphics card, and the fitment here is just absolutely crazy. And to give you an idea what the fitment looks like here, I mean, this front panel cutout was an absolute lifesaver. If this front panel cutout wasn't here, then yeah, there is just no way that you're installing a graphics card this big. So there's another look at the fitment. Let's get the panels on and honestly just see how this thing performs. Let's start with the CPU, where we were pretty much spot on with the 12700K being the limit of what you can install here. Now, I haven't done any undervolting or anything like that, and we're running our radiator fans at around 1300 RPM. With the 12700K at full load, pulling 190 watts plus in Cinebench, we do actually hit the thermal limit of 100 degrees C on a couple of those performance CPU cores. Blender is a bit more tolerating. The i7 here pulled slightly less power overall, but things are still getting pretty toasty. So a small undervolt in the BIOS will help things a little bit for the CPU here, as well as a faster fan speed. I would say that the 12700K is still actually fine here for most workloads, but definitely do not bother with the i9 12900K. If that's a chip that you do want to take full advantage of, you are much better off with the Meshlicious or the NR200P Max. The GPU, on the other hand, now that's where I was pretty impressed. The GPU that we've installed here is is the RX 6700 XT ROG Strix, which tops out at around 250 watts, and as we can see here, that has absolutely no problem staying cool at all. Although I will say fan speed was a little bit louder and faster than I'd like by default, so dropping that down to a much quieter 1200 RPM or so, we are still able to maintain very reasonable GPU temps. So I'd say looking at this, an RTX 3080 with a small undervolt would be probably about as far as I'd want to push this case myself while still maintaining comfortable noise levels, and there I would definitely still recommend going with a beefy cooler design like the ROG Strix. Now, as a point of reference, when we drop in the RTX 2070 Super Founders Edition and compare that to the rest of our test data, performance is pretty good overall. It's 2 degrees better than the Form T1 when both cases are running a top-mounted 240mm AIO, and only a few degrees warmer than one of the highest airflow mid-towers that you can buy at the moment. All in all, it's about the kind of GPU thermals that you'd expect coming from a DAN case of this size, and all of the cases that it's beaten by on this list are in fact larger cases, so do keep that in mind. As for current Founders Edition cards like the RTX 3080, that would also be a good pairing here for the A4-H2O, but you would need to install the included standoffs for the riser cable. You'd pretty much end up there with a similar airflow setup as we've tested in the Form T1, and that does perform okay. Those standoffs weren't included with this review unit, however, so that's not something that I can test just yet. So overall, pretty impressed, and I would say that this is one of the best ITX cases that you can buy at the moment, alongside the Meshlicious and the NR200P Max. Those are slightly bigger cases. In some people's eyes, they are, considerably larger cases, but this is as small as I would recommend going if you're also considering, the sizes and the thermal constraints of modern hardware. So if you're considering a 3-slot GPU, if you're considering an i7, this is about as small as I would recommend going. I would especially recommend this case if you're not going super crazy with your components. So 12600K, RTX 3070, that would run pretty much perfect here in my opinion, and up to a 3080, 6800 XT would also be fine, but there you definitely want to go with a big cooler design and maybe even consider undervolting. Once we start getting into the i9 builds, the 3080 Ti's, 3090s and stuff like that, that's where it definitely does make sense to go a little bit bigger, but otherwise this smaller form factor is totally viable. Most of all, I'm just kind of personally happy, I guess, to see an ITX PC case come out that is truly ITX and truly compact, but at the same time it's really attacking that challenge of big graphics cards and decently powered CPUs as well. Like I said in the intro, this is about as small as you can make a PC case today while, not compromising on any of those things, which is really, really great to see. So I will leave it linked down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.